James 1, verses 5 through 8 in the Christian Standard Bible. Now, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without doubting. For the doubter is like the surging sea, driven and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord, being double-minded and unstable in all his ways. Here, James is in the middle of writing about trials that everyone must face in life. He writes that we need to turn to God for wisdom in our trials, and that our trials are going to help build our faith. After this verse, James even warns the reader not to attribute any temptations that they face to God. So this verse seems to condemn having doubts in our struggles. Joe Day, do you think the author's intent is truly to tell the readers to continue on to what's next without any doubts at all?
No, I don't. I don't think that it's explicitly saying that that doubts are bad. Just that endurance matters more.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Whole Church Podcast. We are back with our What's Next series, asking people what's next after some stuff going through life, because the whole church isn't always in the same place in life, and we're just trying to figure out how we navigate these different areas in life better. Mostly ministry related. Today we're going to be talking about what's next after a split in ministry or a split in ministry leadership. So, naturally, I'm Joshua Noel. I'm here as always. I'm one of your co-hosts, the one that you don't care about. The eyes of Sauron over there are truly the eyes of one far more terrifying, the one and only TJ Tiberius Blackwell. How's it going?
Oh, it's going. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And of course, we are joined by really the only guest that makes sense for this episode, the one and only. He does like a million podcasts. BuddyWalk with Jesus, Thoughts from a Bearded Geek. He's also a pastor of home church and other things. Pastor Joe Day, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. Good to have you, man.
Of course. And you should really check us out on the On Ministry Podcast Network. The website link is below. And you ever been in public and thought like, man, I really wish I could help the whole church and start uniting these people? Well, there's a way. It's natural, it's easy, and it requires a small sort of donation to our merch website. You wear the shirt, and it's a great icebreaker. Like, hey, what is that logo? And you're like, well, let me tell you.
Yeah. Also coffee mug, but I feel like you're less frequently out in public with a coffee mug.
Yeah, almost never.
Yeah. But maybe, I don't know. Anyway, with that said, as everyone knows, I have a favorite form of unity, and it is the holy sacrament of silliness. And for this series, Joe, instead of doing a silly question, we're doing a silly story. And everyone has to finish the same story in this series, where we're doing the world's second greatest compilation of stories. I hope you're ready for this one. Joe, you got to finish the story. Once upon a time, TJ was playing ping pong against a sea turtle on board a steam engine train when he
dropped the paddle when the sea turtle decided that it was going to teach him the sacred art of ninjutsu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that checks out.
Yeah, no, it's very real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, why would the turtle want to play ping pong when it could teach you ninjutsu?
Exactly.
Yeah, checks out to me.
Yeah, it's crazy how many of these are true.
Yeah, it is pretty wild. Anyway, with that, to start off, Joe, would you mind sharing with us some about the different splits in ministry that you have either gone through or witnessed yourself.
Yeah, so unfortunately, in some ways, I am a little bit of a statistic when it comes to facing this sort of thing. So, when I started Buddy Walk with Jesus originally, it was with a co-host and a dude that was so instrumental in a lot of ways of allowing me to ask hard questions and buck against the system and all of those kinds of things. But a year, 2 years in, and our visions for what we were doing started going in different directions, and tensions started to rise, and it came to, unfortunately, a point of contention at first, and then ultimately deciding to go two different directions, and he left the ministry, and so I started doing it solo. And so that was kind of the first time specifically in ministry that I had experienced what it means to separate from somebody that you were doing ministry with. I've also experienced this in the house church arena where I was leading a house church, and I had taken up a position working with a local Sunday morning model church. And for a lot of folks in the house church world, that Sunday morning model is not really a welcoming concept, a welcome environment, or and especially to have somebody within leadership of their church looking to also go and work over there. For some, that can be a very hard idea to try and reconcile. Unfortunately, it wasn't handled in a way where there was a mutual decision to part company and things like that. A section of the church kind of had gotten together and then came to me and basically gave a vote of no confidence and decided to leave, and it kind of imploded the house church and all of that. One that I think is worth mentioning specifically is my time having helped get systematic ecology up off the ground.
Yeah.
I was one of the voices that came on early on in the scouting phase of looking for talent, and then it ended up where there was a handful of us that were like the collective brain trust for decision making and for planning, and if you want to call it that. I can make jokes about it now because it was absurd in a lot of ways, but didn't end well. It wasn't a happy ending. There was a parting of company that involved a lot of hurt feelings that needed to get worked through and all of that kind of stuff. So those are just those are some of the high points that I can point to of situations. Each one was unique, kind of in its own way, and each one served as a specific catalyst for some sort of lesson or some sort of growth to come out of it. But I'm sure that's part of the conversation that we'll get to.
Yeah. Well, that was what I was going to ask next. So you feel like these have been opportunities to learn and grow, or just kind of be demoralized and put down?
I think it depends on when you ask me as to what was actually happening. I think at any point I would give you a nice answer that says, you lose, or whenever you take an L in life, you can learn a lesson and all of that sort of jazz. but you have to ask the question, what are you saying versus what are you living? Like, what are you actually experiencing? And at each one of them had a period of looking around at the wreckage and the rubble and having some kind of reaction to it. Now, I'll be the first one to admit, I used to live by the motto of may the light from the burning bridges light your path. That was, I didn't necessarily care about wreckage or the things that were left behind from any parting of companies, and that was something that was left over from my time pre-Christ, and definitely without me making a cognizant choice, bled through into my time since having my come to Jesus moment, because it turns out that the things, the mess and nonsense that you have before becoming a Christian, if you don't address any of that, you just kind of carry that stuff into your time as a Christian. And so for me, it had to, there had to be a process, there had to be time, there had to be other people coming into my life and breaking the paradigm that I had built to be able to see the wide angle view of the radical choice. And we're all geeks here, right? So in the immortal words of the great philosopher, I think Harvey Dent, Batman Begins fans, don't come too hard for me, but I think it was Harvey Dent that said, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And for any one of those situations, for any one of those instances that I pointed to, there is a version of that story that has me as the villain, just like there's a version of that story that had the ringleader for the group that broke off from the house church as the villain, or Edgar, my old broadcast partner, as the villain, or Josh here as the villain. Likewise, there's a version of every single one of those where I'm the villain. And that forced me to be analytical about the entirety of the situation, and that was where I could start to process things in a way that allowed for growth and allowed for a deeper understanding of me, of, why did I react that way? Why did I think that way? Why did I bring what I brought to the situation? And likewise, why did it go down the way that it went down? Because it always takes two to tango. You can't take all of the responsibility on yourself. Likewise, you can't throw your hands up and say, I did absolutely nothing to influence this situation, and it's all on somebody else.
Yeah. I was going to mention, in case people didn't know, when you said SG, that's the other podcast that we were/are all a part of. This is the Geek podcast that TJ and I are still hosts on. Joe is still pretty heavily involved in some different ways now. But I think it was about a year after that where we didn't really see Joe on the show because of what all happened between us. We don't need to get into the details, just kind of letting people know enough, I guess.
Yeah.
I also kind of wanted to see, TJ, have you ever been at a church or anything where there was like a split in the ministry or the leadership or anything?
Not a split so much as more of a, I've seen people leave churches for various reasons, but not congregation-wise. Everyone started sitting on one side of the gym or anything like that.
Yeah. I had a unique experience myself when I was in Wilmington, when I went to college. The first church I went to, there was a few different churches I was involved in while I was there, but the first one I went to was an Assemblies of God. And me being me, don't ask any questions. They're Pentecostal. I'm Pentecostal. I show up at the door because it's walking distance from the school and I don't have a car. Yeah. So I show up. I had a good time. I liked all the people. And it wasn't until probably a month or two in that I found out I showed up like weeks after their pastor was basically kicked out and replaced with a new pastor. And it had to do something with financial stuff. I'm not sure what the details are, so I'm not going to say them because I'm not 100% certain. And, don't want to gossip. But because of whatever happened, eventually, while I was there, the old pastor came back. So then everybody with the new pastor left to get a new building. And then the new guy came into the old church, and it was like a true split where half of the people went with the new pastor, and then half of them went with the guy who left and came back. And it was messy, especially because I was the children's pastor at the time. And I was like, I don't know where I'm supposed to go. I have literally no dog in this race. Like, I don't know I don't know this old guy.
So I'll chime in here because before I even became a Christian, I experienced a church split, like you were talking about, Josh. In that almost purest sense of the term, I was a part of a church plant that had two pastors, incredibly diametrically opposed to each other in approach and tone and background and all of that. One was very like kingdom focused, very open the door to everybody, and it's more about how you live. It's more about the applicability of Matthew 5-7 and the impact of the Holy Spirit, whereas the other one was a little bit more swayed towards fundamentalism, a little bit more swayed towards like the higher church sort of approach to Sunday morning. And while I personally stand on the fact that I would never go back to solo pastoring, I just think it's risky business. I don't think it's sinful, but I just think it's risky business being a solo pastor. It showed me a very valuable lesson of, even in having a plurality of pastors, having the right people working together for a church plant really does matter. And I don't know I think the answer as far as whether or not you go diametrically opposed or you go super unified or some variety thereof is something that you can, it's situational. But it was fine for 6-8 months, something like that. And then over time, the gears were grinding, and then eventually the wheels fall off, dude leaves, and a very sizable portion of the congregation goes with him. And unfortunately, it wasn't even to like go start another church, because like neither pastor was necessarily like heretical from what I remember. I'm trying to retrofit what I understand now of theology back then, so who knows. But it's not like they went to some place, which is unfortunate. But yeah, those are the kinds of things that very well can happen within a church setting. And I think how we handle things in a non-church setting will inform how we handle these things when confronted with them in a larger sense of community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're definitely going to talk more about splitting in just a minute, but just for a little background, if this is the first time you're hearing this, series or the show, welcome. But this is our What's Next series. We started it as a bit of a joke because we were running out of ideas for the show, and we're just kind of fooling around, asking guests what we should do next on our podcast. And we've talked to people from all kinds of denominations, backgrounds, traditions. You name them, we've spoken to somebody who we could find a picture with, like 7 pictures away. Have you guys seen that? That's crazy. But every person can be linked to another person in 7 photos or less.
Yeah, 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Like, there's a couple of ways that it gets talked about. Yeah,
it's wild. So, Joe Day, what do you think we should do next on the show?
I think you should survey as many people as you can and just get the variety of different takes on what people think the end of the world is going to be like.
Yeah, that does sound like a fun one. We probably will do that.
Eschatology
Long
series
project,
still sounds
though.
fun.
Yeah. So, with that being said, another thing we're doing on this series is we're playing First Thoughts. So, Joe, I need you to pick a number between 1 and 26.
17.
17, all right. I'm going to give you that many words from our list in a random order. And I need you to tell us the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear that word. Are you ready?
So by 17, 3. No, I'm playing. Go ahead.
All right. Beowulf.
Book.
Jack.
Car.
Poetry.
In motion.
It can be more than one word or phrase. You know, it's just whatever your first thought is. So, inerrant.
False.
Animation.
Aladdin.
Panda.
Bear.
Money.
Is the root of all... No, I'm playing. Presidents.
Politics.
Waste of time.
Dragon.
Slayer.
Marvel.
DC.
Eucharist.
Holy.
Banana.
Peanut butter.
Podcast.
The best way to convey thoughts in the modern context.
What about trumpet?
It makes me think of those things, crumpets, the little snack cakes from back in the day.
Okay, all right. Imago Dei.
Image bearers.
Bassett.
Hounds.
Hanukkah.
I want to experience the celebration.
What about Jesus?
I would love to sit down and experience a meal that he specifically cooked, because something tells me that dude knew how to cook.
Had to. Platypus?
Ridiculous.
Fair. Zoo.
Tigers.
All right. I feel like I've lost count, but I'm pretty
Say,
sure
how on earth are you
that
counting?
was 16. Pretty sure that was 16.
Okay.
So, for our last one, we're going to go with atonement.
Christus Victor.
All right.
I just want to point out, to be unhelpful for everyone, it didn't say what he believes. Just his first thought. He didn't finish that thought. It could be Christus Victor is awful. You'll never know until you go over to BuddyWalk with Jesus and listen to him talk about atonements on his own podcast.
Yep.
Yeah.
There we go. That's the lore.
That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, your first thought about something is what you like hate the
What
most.
you don't like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe he despises peanut butter too. We don't.
Quite possible.
I think you might.
You know, I know a few different people, like chefs, who have learned to just not like peanut butter for different reasons that I've talked to. But that's a different conversation for another day.
Yeah.
But anyway, Joe, back to the actual subject at hand. What do you think are some of the most common reasons for a split in ministry?
So I think, unfortunately, the reason for the actual split tends to come down to a lack of communication on one side, or just a separation of ideals on the other side. Like, that's talking to the point of, like, we've gone through, these are where we differ, this is how we see things differently, and at this point we have decided that the best course of action is to part company and go different ways. That tends to be the point where that line is drawn. Is it's either people are not communicating with each other, or you've realized that your vision is just simply too unreconcilably different than the other person's, that it's no longer effective to be working together. There's a lot of road that leads to that you could get into, what leads to the point of saying we must part company, this cannot go on any longer. But that, in my experience, is a different part of the journey than the actual thing that leads to making the decision to cut, because your mileage may vary on how much of a runway that you have before realizing it's time. The time has come. Like I point to Edgar, and I think Edgar and I both, if we would be honest about it, I think we were outgrowing each other for a while before we finally made the decision, and that moment happened. Whereas if you look at something like SG, it was a lot faster paced. Even if there was a lot of runway, it was more explosive, I think, is a better way of putting it than necessarily faster paced. One of the things that I've heard recently that really has given me new lyrics to processing what leads to this kind of separation, what leads to such a difference of opinion that you cannot work together. And I heard somebody put it in terms of the restaurant business. So for those of you that don't know, I spent well over a decade running kitchens all over the country. Still to this day, even though I am not active in the industry, my number one love will always be the culinary world. That a restaurant tends to be broken up into two specific points of view: the front of house and the back of house. The front of house, if you run an entire restaurant off of the perspective of just the front of house, you will likely end up with a dynamic that is incredible with hospitality and absolutely terrible for systems and execution and consistency. Just like if you run a restaurant specifically based off of the back of the house's perspective, you will be incredibly proficient and wonderfully mechanical and exact to a T, but hospitality will be sacrificed without a doubt. So that's why every successful restaurant has a dynamic of having somebody working with somebody from the front of the house working with somebody from the back of the house, because that is simply the only way that you can have a perspective that is for the best of the restaurant as a whole and everybody involved in it. Part of that is give and take. Part of that is, what does each person bring to the dance? What does each person bring good? What are the strengths that each person involved that's working together can bring to the table? What are the weaknesses, and what are you going to do with those weaknesses? Because I think for every implosion that we see, in some form or fashion, 52 different flavors. Guys, it's like Burger King in here. You can have it your way. Customize the whole 9 yards. When it comes to how does it actually look? What does it actually look like? What does it actually play out like? There tends to be some breakdown in the variety of perspectives being able to come together and give and take and collaborate to be able to work together for the benefit of everybody. And in the world of ministry, it tends to be high emotion. It tends to bring people with high emotions and a lot of opinions. I can point to any one of those situations and say, these are the positives that I brought to those dynamics, and the things that I can say I am inherently really, really good at. But I can also point to, in any one of those situations, this is where my baggage came along with it. This is where I dropped the ball. This is where I could have done things differently. And so when you look at the full paradigm of it, you realize just how very real it is to say it always takes two to tango.
Mm-hmm. So, in your experience, and if anyone is going to open that back of house only restaurant, let me know. That sounds great. But
Yeah, I'm down.
if in your experience, what impact have the splits had on, the congregations they're affecting? Like what happens to the leaders and the followers?
There tends to be a heightened sense of turmoil that can come out of situations like this, because inherently in the West, we put a lot of trust in the pastor, and we associate a lot of we associate a lot of responsibility and emotion and reliance, both good and bad, on this one central figure, or these figures in plurality. And so if you're talking about from a purely congregational standpoint, there's almost this feeling of the foundation getting hit, and there being uneasy ground because there's a conflict in leadership. And unfortunately, it's a weird combination of secrecy coupled with a lot of people in the congregation simply don't want to know about what's going on. They just want to have more of a superhero sort of image of the pastoral team. And thus it leads to a lot of ambiguity, which tends to leave a lot of open doors to folks creating a narrative to fill in the gaps. Now, if you're talking about something that is handled outside of the paradigm of church, that's more of a ministry that still maybe draws a following, has an impact on other people, different things like that, that's where it can become really unique in how the ripple effects are felt, because you spend enough time in church history, you can tend to find a lot of the major through lines. The unique nature of it is still there, but there are through lines of, super conservative churches, super liberal churches, super open churches, super closed off churches, churches in the city, churches in the country. You can tend to find a consistency in how some of that can play out. With ministries that are not specifically churches, that's where I would almost wager that more of the impact is felt on the people that are acting within the ministry rather than the people that are affected within the ministry. And there can be a lot of things that spiral out of that when you start to talk about the mental health of it all, how a person that's involved in the split at ground zero handles it, and how do you move forward from there?
Right. So how can we help with the healing process when these splits happen?
Define we.
You know, I, every man listening, every person who cares.
Understand that in every single dynamic, it is a collection of human beings that have come together for a central mission and vision. That nobody is a superhero, and even though they are a leader, and especially even if they are a pastor, priest, preacher, father, padre, whatever you want to call it, it all rings true that it is flesh and blood people that are engaging with a role and a responsibility. And oftentimes one that has far too many responsibilities attached to it than it actually should. Because that's its own conversation. That priest, pastor, padre, whatever, tends to be a catch-all phrase for a whole lot of what should be separate roles and functions within a church. So if we can understand that the people in the front of the room, the people quote unquote in charge, are flesh bags too, are subject to the life of the carbon-based life form, hopefully then that has a ripple effect on understanding that there is such a measure of grace that we need to have with each other in order to have actual cooperative collaboration. There has to be such an unreasonable level of hospitality, charity, and grace that is given to each other in order to accept the fact that it is simply a matter of time until the wheels go off the tracks. It's not about not allowing the wheels to go off the tracks. It's about how do you correct once the wheels have come off the tracks? Because humans are going to drop the ball. Now, how do you respond to humans dropping the ball?
Yeah. Can I backtrack for a second to something you said? You talking about ministries that are outside of the church, which podcasts are easy example. People who I'm trying to think of other examples. I guess because I'm just so engaged in the podcast world, that's the only thing my brain's thinking of right now. But obviously, there's food drives, there's other charity work out in the community, even some schools. I don't know, different ministries. I'm trying to think of the different things that are encapsulated in that conversation. But you mentioned how that split a lot of the times will affect the people leading it more than the people who are actually impacted by the ministry. Could you kind of just unpack what you meant by that?
So, if we're talking about the two paths of church-related ministry and non-church-related ministry, in church-related ministry, when the bomb goes off, it tends to be way closer, and thus the ripple effects and the shrapnel are felt more immediately by the people who are surrounding the core implosion. Whereas non-church related ministry, there can be more space between the leadership dynamic of the people involved in the ministry and the people who are affected by the ministry. Now, sometimes the explosion is big enough that the ripple effects make the distance, and they are felt by the people that are engaging with the ministry. But oftentimes, the people who really feel the impact of the blast are the team surrounded around the conflict. I'll use SG for an example.
Yeah.
We are given to looking at new media, NU media, as a prime example of a non-church related ministry that we can engage in, because every single one of us is heavily steeped in both recorded content, live streams, postings, and allowing for these different areas to act as digital street corners. By way of that, there doesn't tend to be that same level of relationship where the people who are engaging with new media are directly impacted by conflicts between the team that is producing the content. So you take systematic ecology. What happened? Well, suddenly I wasn't there anymore. The lights stayed on. The wheels kept turning. Episodes kept coming out. Episodes kept being recorded. And I'm happy that to this day, systematic ecology is alive and thriving in a lot of ways better than it ever has before. A lot of what was just a dream back then, y'all have turned into a reality. But the conflict that happened, those series of days and those issues that had that central brain trust, the three of us going our own separate ways, there's a whole group of people who'll never know that story. Now, they don't need to. That doesn't need to be known by everybody. But it's not the same impact on the people that are engaging with it. I'll take the homeless ministry that I help out with. There was the only conflict in leadership that was felt by the people who were engaging with the ministry was when the local mission changed the entire paradigm on how they do food distribution and how they run the mission and all that sort of jazz. There were other conflicts within leadership that the homeless community or people that are dealing with food scarcity will never know about, because it's not for them to know about, because they are coming to engage with the service that the ministry is providing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's I think that's a good example, because a lot of times the hungry are coming, they're going to get food. If they get food, that's like the extent that they're thinking about that ministry is, because that is what they need. Podcast was a good example too. I think what's stands out to me about what you're saying and why I wanted you to unpack that is just there's a lot of unfelt and unheard pain, unless you are literally in that leadership. It's okay, well, the food got to who it needed to go to, mission well done, you don't think about it again. So I just think it's good to bring up, especially because I don't think people think of like ministry leaders and pastors as humans a lot of the time, and I was like, oh, no, they feel the pain.
That's why I make it a point and to when TJ asks something like, how can the everyman be of help in this situation? How can the everyman respond in a way that's beneficial to the people that are involved? The number one answer has to be, remember that the people involved are human. Remember that these are people too, because that will impact how you view them, how you view other people, how you view ministry leaders as a whole, because that's what you're starting to touch on is the other side of the conversation. Half of it is, how do you do this in a way? How do you part company if you get to the point of it's time to go? How do you do so in a way that either minimizes the blast radius or does not damage the people around or the people that are affected by the ministry, whether it is within a church or not? The other side of the conversation is talking about the life of the person in ministry that has experienced these things, because the mental health dynamic of this conversation is so vital and so real, and unfortunately is oftentimes one of the least regarded aspects of the conversation, because the other side of the conversation is so important. It also gets coupled with this pervasive thought that the people that are involved in the conflict are something other than human, and thus don't need to be regarded in the entirety of the dynamic.
Right. Well, on one side of that, do you think it's possible for a ministry split to help engender like greater church unity on the larger scale?
I do. I think there are examples where folks understand that we are all one big family, but still hold to a preference. And preferences aren't bad. Shout out to member of the Anazao network coming over to one of my shows. Brandon Knight has been and will be for the next several weeks at time of the recording, be appearing on the show, talking about a lot of this same stuff of how do we deal with our preferences, and what impact should that have on how we view church and how we engage with church and all that jazz. But there's not a problem with preference so long as there's still a cooperation between preferences that supersedes the differences of those preferences. Because if this group over here, we're still connected, right? But this group over here elects to do business in a certain kind of way, and they are flourishing and everything is sunshine and rainbows because the people involved feel the freedom to be able to express themselves in the way that collectively is acceptable and is the status quo. That's a beautiful thing. Just like if this group over here feels the need or feels the preference to do things their own way, again, cooperation, but still has that freedom to express themselves just different. And again, I go back to the whole podcast ministry thing, because when I left, it was finally time to just start my own thing, to just start my own network. And I'm very happy to say that there are tons of examples of cooperation between our two groups, and the relationship between the two groups is stronger than ever. And there's a lot of crisscross, but ultimately at the end of the day, the specifics of how we do things are different between our two groups. And I, for one, think that if you can express the preference while maintaining the core of unity, that is such a beautiful thing, and speaks to the actual thesis statement that is the book of Acts, in showing that the expression is not one size fits all. As we see the movement of Christianity taking place, the expression is not one size fits all, but the undercurrent, theology prime, that is the connective tissue that allows for the freedom of expression to do things in different ways.
Yeah.
So, if a relationship is damaged in a ministry split, whose responsibility do you think it is to reach out, to rectify, and begin, healing some of that damage that's done?
So the answer most of the time is some version of yes. You know, everybody involved has a burden of responsibility when it comes to reconciliation. That being said, if there is a person that has been the catalyst for all of it, like everybody brings their own baggage to the table, but there are situations where there is a clear and present person who really lit the fuse to start the explosion, then that person, there tends to be a need to have to separate out and process out guilt and shame. If there is remorse for what has happened, that you need to be able to, okay, stop shaming yourself and step forward and say, okay, this is going to be messy. This is going to get weird, but we need to do this. Both all parties, you know, if it's two people, both, if it's more, all need to be willing to get into the cage, lock the door, and have it out, and really, you know, as the old saying goes, don't go to bed angry. Be willing to discuss everything in efforts of at least being open and starting down that road of what reconciliation could look like. As to who starts it, I think there's always an argument for any person involved to have to step forward in some way. So whoever initiates it is whoever initiates it.
Yeah, and if there's like a serial ministerial splitter running around, then that guy, obviously. But we've got like 7 degrees of Mars Hill, and this one person is, you know, caused 8 different ministry splits. Maybe it's time to stop forming ministries with that person.
Yeah, there has to be an awareness whenever you're processing. If the idea is that you are authentically trying to process what has happened, and for the person who has experienced this level of split and doesn't know where to go next, doesn't know how to process any of what's going on, what is eventually going to need to take place is you're going to need to come to grips with yourself. You are going to need to become self-actualized to the point where you are willing to ask yourself the question, why? Why did I respond like this? Why did this happen? What did I bring to this equation? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you cannot control what other people do or say. So even if another person was involved and you feel wronged by the other person, you cannot affect how they are going to respond to you, but you can affect how you are going to respond to them. And so being willing to do the hard work of getting into the nuts and bolts of asking those questions is so key to being able to move forward in any direction, in any flavor of how this looks. Because then you can be honest between yourself and God and ask the question, am I the 7 degrees of Mars Hill guy? Right. Am I the problem in this situation? If I keep watching bombs go off around me, is that just the way it be sometimes? Or am I walking around low-key lighting fuses in different situations and things like that? I'll be honest, I had to do the hard work and say, yeah, in some aspects of this situation and this dynamic, I'm the heavy. I need to figure out some things about me and figure that and get my mind wrapped around that if I'm gonna move forward at all. If I'm going to actually strive to be different, to allow these things to inform who I am and how I respond next time, then I have to be aware of that reality. Likewise, I can look at any of the situations that I have brought up and say, okay, yeah, this is where I got pressed. This is what the other person brought into it. This is what the situation was outside of what I added to it. Both are aspects of it, but the core root of it is being aware of your role in it. Because if you are, that is honestly how you serve others in the situation, is by being aware of yourself. Because how you are going to respond is going to affect the lives of other people.
Yeah. And I am just going to reemphasize where he said the answer is yes when it comes to who should reach out first, especially because you mentioned miscommunication. And speaking from my own experience, I also think largely a lot of the times for myself and probably others like me, especially common in ministries, lack of communication is the miscommunication. And if you split because you never discussed the things and just let it build up, and then you have a split, those are the people that are least likely to be the ones to actually reach out and fix it because they were already not communicating.
Right.
So that's the challenge, and you just kind of got to pull a Nike and just do it.
Yeah. So, is there anything that you think we just might not have thought of that would be important to think about after going through a split?
I don't think it's anything groundbreaking that hasn't already been included. Just allow the depths of the realities of each part of this conversation to breathe. Allow the depths of reality of sitting with what happened, being okay with being uncomfortable, and going back to and living in the truth of what happened. Don't hide from it. And then ask the question, what's next? You see what I did there? You ask the question of, how do I move forward from what has happened and what needs to happen? And sometimes that is you start to reach out to people who may have been affected by the split, or you go introspective and you start to say, okay, what do I need to do to start to heal, to be able to think about this thing clearly, and so on and so forth. That the specifics of the dynamics are so unique, but there are core through lines that you have to take seriously if you are going to allow the scars to form, but not become sources of long-term toxicity or long-term ramifications that develop into bitterness or unwillingness to engage with other people or different things like that.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, Joe, as you know, one thing we like to do at the end of our show is just to ask our guest for a practical action, something tangible our listeners could go do now that would help better engender church unity. And after a talk like today, it's a topic that, this is something we greatly strive for, and sometimes it can be more challenging than others. But what's something practical you think our listeners could go do right now that would help better engender unity?
You gotta go and listen, and not listen to respond, but actually listen. The more time that I spend on this earth, the more I come to understand that people tend to prefer to be heard rather than agreed with. And if we could have engagements, even engagements that do not result in everybody agrees about all things, that involve a baseline of people being heard, then we can step forward in any context with the ability to allow for situations to quickly get disarmed, and the heightened emotion of an initial conflict or a heightened emotion of an expected outcome or a conflict in perspective or a mismatch in language, a lot of these things will at least become immediately manageable if everybody involved just feels like they're being heard.
Mm-hmm. So what happens if we all start listening to learn instead of listening to speak? What changes?
Honestly, hopefully, our perspective. Hopefully, we understand that the world is a lot bigger than the way that we see it. And it allows us the opportunity to be able to look at the world around us from a fuller point of view that gives the room for considering not just our preferences, but how our preferences affect other people, or how our words affect other people, or what other people think in specific situations.
Right, right. So, before we wrap up, we like to do a little thing. We make everyone share. Well, we ask them to. It's not mandatory, I guess, but it is because I'm asking so nicely for you to share a moment where you saw God recently, whether it was a blessing, a challenge, a moment of worship. I always make Josh go first to give the rest of us time to think. So, Josh, do you have a God moment for us this week?
Yeah. I was trying to remember because I had one last week that I didn't use because we didn't record last week. But I can't remember what it was. But it was a good one. TJ, could you go and then give me a minute?
You're not living up to your reputation here.
I know it's bad.
But yeah, no, I can. So for me, I, it's time of recording. Labor Day was yesterday. So special to me to be able to take a break from everything. And when I say that, I did work yesterday because we work in a restaurant. But slow everything down a little bit and get with your family and just take a moment to realize how God is working in each and every one of their lives, because every person you know is their own person, and life is constantly changing for everybody.
True.
I still don't remember what mine last week was going to be. But this week, and I should have gone first because TJ was way better than mine. Mine's just going to be, turns out this year we had really high expectations for my college football team, and they suck. And
Shocking.
It's been two really, really bad games. And there's always that God moment of being challenged of like, hey, there is literally no reason this should affect my day at all other than, darn, been cool if we won, you know? So just kind of remembering to put the main things, and not to get too upset about little stuff that literally just doesn't matter.
I would like to take part of what TJ said, and just so that way it gives light to what Josh said. He's talking about how his team is done, and at time of recording, it is just coming off of Labor Day. So like college football season is like, I don't know, a week old, but yeah, it's already.
No, that's actually just how it works though.
So my God moment recently, I was I teach one of the many things that I do, and I taught a class on essentially hermeneutics, and I had a student who was older and kind of coming out of a particular model of biblical interpretation and all that jazz. And culturally, there were a lot of reasons why we might not have connected the way that we did. And to look at what God was able to do with such an odd couple pairing between he and I was just so cool to take in and to be involved with.
Yeah, I'm glad he went last. He had the church unity God moment. Like that's like
Yeah.
the golden ticket. Yeah.
Yeah, those are the best ones, I think. We don't rank them publicly, but
Yeah.
that
that's
was
a
good.
private list.
Yeah. So, if you like this episode, if you hated this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend, an enemy, your cousin, whatever you have in your life. Share with everybody. If you would like
Yeah.
a stack of business cards for the Whole Church podcast, let us know. We can send you
We don't
that
have
if you
those.
promise to hand them. Shut up. We can get all those handed out. Get in the Discord server with us. Get on our notes. Give us, it's fun. It's a fun time.
Yeah.
You get to bug us.
Yeah. Also, check out the Amazon Ministry Podcast Network. We got a lot of new shows coming up, so check out the Kung Fu Pizza Party with Brandon Knight, and we also have a kind of a mosh posh. We're not even sure who's hosting it, but it'll be out by the time this comes out, I think. Yeah. Anyway, Some Joyful Noises. So, music podcast with no rhyme, rhythm, or reason. Yeah, it'll be great.
Yeah. 3 things that you famously do not need for music. We hope
Exactly.
you enjoyed the show. Next week, we're going to have on Pastor Will Rose to discuss what we should do after finding normalcy in our chaotic times. Then we're going to do an outro episode reviewing this series before taking a week off, as we are wont to do after a series, and doing a crossover episode with Systematic Geekology to discuss the MCU after Endgame. And finally, at the end of Season 1... Oh yeah, big things coming up. But at the end of Season 1, Francis Chan is going to be on the show.
Whoa. He doesn't know. That's our end game.
Yeah.
Wow.
It might even be a Francis Chan from another dimension. King Dynasty.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.